Well, an exciting time in the world generally, but especially in the world of CPGs. So, had to have a conversation with our resident economist Joel here about all things tariffs as we see an evolving story, right? And I think a lot to unpack, a lot of uncertainty, but excited to kind of dig in a little bit deeper.
I think there was a Twitter or X now flame war from Elon Musk about how having a PhD in economics makes you less qualified to talk about this. So good news for me. I didn't get my PhD. I dropped out.
That's right. You can join the ranks there. You're a true expert as the dropout.
That's right. Building real businesses, none of this fake academic stuff. Yes, and exciting, I think, is one term you can use for it, Logan. I'm not sure that's how our customers feel about it right now when we talk to them. I think feels a little more like what in the world is going on.
Yes, I mean it's all about uncertainty and what should we do. So I think we have a unique vantage because we had a lot of conversations late last week to get people's initial reads, but I don't think that we've been able to bring together this is exactly what people should do and what to expect. So I guess for you, Joel, what are we hearing? What are we seeing as we've kind of seen these tariffs emerge?
Well, I think first and foremost is nobody knows what is going to happen, right? I mean, it's currently Monday, April 7th. These were announced, last Thursday. Obviously, the markets are roiling. But at least as I've talked to customers, as I've heard what people internally are hearing from customers, everyone kind of says, we just don't know. And uncertainty just breeds, I guess, a freezing. I was reading something earlier today, and it was saying, unlike the financial crisis where there was kind of a race to get liquidity, or there are times where it's clear what you're supposed to do. It's not clear right now really that there's anything to do, right? It's not like somebody's going to be moving their manufacturing today. Maybe you're expediting some freight. I think we've heard that anecdotally, people trying to push things in to beat the tariffs. But nobody knows how long this is going to last. Is it really going to be permanent? Is it all going to go away in a couple weeks? And so it kind of feels mostly like business as usual, just with this kind of looming problem that people are starting to say, okay, let's at least scenario plan for what do we do. So that is what we've heard is people say, okay, what's going on? And then, most practically, at least in the world of consumer goods and retail, that gets to, all right, if I'm going to have to if more costs are coming in, who's paying for this? Is it me? Is it the retailer? Is it the consumer, or some mix of all three? And so I think that's probably the real calculation people are starting to play with.
Yeah. I think what's interesting is really all year, I think companies have recognized or started to discuss, hey, these are likely coming. How should we think about restructuring supply chains? How should we think about sort of strategically going after this? I think what we found is most folks are pretty surprised by the comprehensiveness and the magnitude, right? And so although we say, hey, there's a lot of sort of scrambling, there have been conversations really all year about supply chain diversification. How do we think about potentially doing more domestic production? But to your point, I think we've seen with customers quite a bit of uncertainty and a lot of, to your point, wait and see, right? Whether it's super short term expediting freight, but also adjusting how people are ordering over the next even couple of days or weeks. It'll be fascinating to see how that impacts on shelf availability and inventory levels and all other sort of downstream impacts on that front.
Yeah, everybody I've talked to is surprised at the magnitude. And, I think if it had been more targeted, the writing's been on the wall around China, right? And you're seeing companies diversify away from China. The problem is that they then moved manufacturing to Vietnam, and then Vietnam gets smacked. So, I think that's what creates a lot of the not knowing what to do. Is you're like, what does this even mean? I mean, short of, even reshoring to the United States, which, anybody who knows this problem knows this is not something that happens quickly, right? If it's practical at all, does that even help you? All your supplies are tariffed. So, and these are, again, decisions that are made over, people projecting out years, decades. And then this kind of comes in very unexpectedly. Now, we've been told that there's going to be tariffs for a while. So again, I don't think it was shocking that something happened, but this magnitude definitely just requires everyone to say, okay, let's try to pick up the pieces and then, see if this is going to be a long-term thing or a short-term thing.
Yeah. When you mentioned something interesting about who bears the cost. And so I think it is an interesting dynamic when you talk about raw material suppliers, when you talk about manufacturers, importers, retailers, consumers. Could you unpack that a little bit more in terms of, okay, if this lasts longer than a couple of days, what that could mean or likely does mean from a sort of who shoulders the cost of all this?
Yeah. So, practically speaking, whoever imports the product is the one who's on the hook for it. Okay. So it's pretty clear whoever owns that. There's lots of different terms when things are being, kind of shipped as to who bears that. But in reality, yes, there's kind of this complex, I think, dance and negotiation that has already started. So if I am a consumer brand, the companies that you and I mostly work with, they have to now decide, okay, how much of this, let's assume that my costs go up 25%. Well, how much of that can I push onto the retailer? Obviously, my goal is that I can push all of it onto the retailer, but that is a delicate balance because that retailer doesn't want to pay more. The retailer in the middle also has this side of saying, well, if I just pass it on to the consumers, or the consumer is going to keep buying it, right? This price elasticity of demand thing of, I think for most Americans, we had all the inflation over a couple years. People are still annoyed about it, even though inflation's now manageable. We'll see if that lasts. But so the idea of having another price, shock is, I think there's a recognition people are not going to take it well. Right? You could pass things on. We heard this from customers a couple of years ago. They're like, man, it's amazing. I can increase my prices twice a year. It's not impacting sales. I don't think anybody believes that's going to happen now. So the retailer has to sit there and say, well, maybe I'll pay a little more for my inputs, but I can't pass it all on. And of course, there's you and I and all the consumers who are going to say, like, what am I going to do if prices go up 25%? Am I going to substitute something else? Am I just not going to buy? So that's the dance. Now, we've heard in some cases, this immediately goes into a little bit bare knuckle. We've heard examples of retailers changing terms on suppliers immediately and like forcing them to pay the tariffs, like changing, how things are actually imported. But again, in practice, everybody's got to figure out how they make money in this. Nobody wants to sell things at a loss.
And it's not like there's just an enormous margin.
There's not an enormous
on this. Yeah.
Yeah. So I feel like at least the consumer brands I've mostly spoken to, I think this feeling of we're going to have to eat some of the cost and we're going to have to work with the retailers and pass some of it on. And what those ratios are, I think is to be determined. I'm sure it's going to vary on the margins for the product, the category, et cetera. We've also heard that retailers, they always play, especially the big ones, right? They're always fighting for the consumer. Walmart's always, very well known for, we are going to provide the lowest, cost for our customer. But we've heard that they're recognizing prices are going to go up, right? Nobody can eat all of this. There's not enough margin, as you said. So yeah, it feels like for the brands, we're going to pass some of it on. We don't know how much can ultimately be passed on to consumers. So, we've gotten quotes of like, well, this will be an interesting experiment. Let's see how it goes. And they're also cutting costs or freezing costs. So I think, we're going to see how much more efficiency you can wring out of this system.
It's an interesting take, but I think that's fair, that it's going to put a lot of pressure on how do we maintain margin and stay efficient at the same time with increasing costs, in some instances, significant increasing costs. So
I guess we're going to see all of them. We're going to see people cutting costs. We're going to see margin compression, and we're going to see prices going up. Right? I mean, every side of it is going to take some chunk. None of them are going to take all of it. And, that's going to be a hard adjustment.
Yeah. Well, now we've talked about the uncertainty of, well, what happens with this? Is this a several days, several weeks, several months? Maybe to prognosticate as we look to if significant tariffs sort of persist, maybe what longer term shifts may happen? Do you have a perspective on, okay, if these stay where they're at, maybe in the position of a consumer packaged goods company, how they may adjust their supply chain, distribution, how consumer behavior might change? Curious if they do, persist, what might happen from your vantage.
Yeah, it's hard to know what is it that I hope will happen versus what may actually happen because it's been so unpredictable. It's hard to believe, even with, I mean, things change by the hour right now, that we're not going to see some deals being struck, right? I would just expect that that's the way our government, the American government, is operating right now, or at least has. And so I imagine we will start to see a set of countries where agreements are reached. Perhaps tariffs aren't eliminated, but at least they're brought down. I don't know what they'll be relative to what they were before. And then those where there's really a trade war, which is kind of the direction it seems like it's going more with China. So, if that happens, I think the first thing that every company is going to think about is this going to last, right? They want that predictability. That's the biggest challenge right now. Everyone's saying it is. It's like you need predictability to invest. But I think if that plays out, then you probably will see an acceleration in terms of how supply chains are reorienting, moving towards countries that have friendlier trade relations with the U.S. and away from those where it's not as good and where it's more volatile. I mean, again, I think just looking at the dynamic with China, and this is why people have been moving away from there. It's just, even if things are okay one day, it just always feels like that could shift too quickly. But does that continue to shift to Vietnam or to India, or does it accelerate the move to Mexico, right? Or the Americas, get it closer? I'm not sure.
Yeah. No, one of the things I was mulling on over the weekend is how these companies may think about the international consumer differently. I think in terms of product development and where we kind of start with a small CPG to kind of expand, you start in the Americas, in the US. My expectation is global consumers may become more relevant for products because we're going to have to make sure that demand can kind of carry the weight of maybe increased costs and deflated demand here domestically. So, trying to expand to global markets may happen sooner. The emphasis in terms of what we're going to produce and how we're going to kind of distribute it may go more global. So that I think will be interesting to follow too.
So I think that's certainly possible. I just don't know how possible that is in the short term. I mean, if you look at markets, it's just the Chinese and the US market are so much bigger than any others. I mean, the EU market's obviously very big, but it's more fragmented. It's a lot of countries. There's a lot more complexity of selling it there than there is selling into the States. And, look, from a traditional economics viewpoint, tariff wars are just going to make Americans poorer, right? I mean, that's the long term. If this were to continue, we as in Americans will become less well off, right? And so I could see a shift over time as other markets become relatively more important and take more of those products. But in the short term, it's a huge market. It's a market nobody can ignore. And again, that's a little bit, I think, the gamesmanship that's going on is saying you can't ignore this market. So even if we make it very hard to do business here, you've got to figure it out.
Yeah. Well, maybe one more question, Joel, for you. If you could provide some advice, what should brands kind of do in the context right now? And what should they be thinking about?
Well, I think I have a lot of sympathy because, running our own business, right? There's a lot of uncertainty right now. And I don't want to make any big changes. And I wouldn't recommend any brand does that right now, right? That just seems ill-advised to respond, to something like this. But I do think they're thinking about the right things. I mean, what we were talking about is you do need a plan for higher costs. Like, it seems like that's coming in one form or another, and start working with your partners on how you're going to deal with that. And I think it is starting to test what is that, how are consumers going to respond? And so I think it starts with looking at anywhere you can shave your own costs. There's also, Logan, I guess we didn't get into this. There are, I think, some tricks that we've been hearing about how you can change some of your invoicing with your manufacturing to be very clear about what constitutes cost of goods sold, what constitutes all of my, brokers' fees, logistics, etc. Sometimes those things get packaged together in that invoice. You're only getting charged the tariff on the COG. So, there are things you can do to make sure you're minimizing your tariff liability. If you will, we're going to tax season, right? We minimize their tax liability. Here's another form of taxes. What can I do on that front? That's not going to solve the problem, but it might make it a little better for you. Mm-hmm. Where can I cut my own costs, minimize what I have to pass on? And then we're in a new world. And let's see how consumers respond to that. So I think people are doing the right things. But I wouldn't be making massive shifts to my supply chain. That might be completely different a couple weeks from now if we have a lot more clarity where you need to make some of those bigger strategic decisions.
Makes sense. So a bit of wait and see, explore cost cutting, or at least identify those, understand your consumer, right? And hey, how sensitive have they been to price historically, and monitor that really closely as we look over the next few days and weeks.
Yeah. And Logan, I'm laughing. My family has a trip to Japan here in 2 months, and my twin boys really they just Nintendo announced the Switch 2. And so they were excited about it. For those who followed this, Nintendo had the unfortunate timing of announcing it. I can't remember if it was the day of. I think it was the day the tariffs were announced later in the afternoon.
Well, they took some pre-orders.
They put in pre-orders, and then subsequently, of course, had to say, okay, we're pausing pre-orders. We're not even sure what this price is going to be. But my sons were like, well, we're going to Japan. Let's just go buy it, and we'll pay in yen. But then I was reading about how apparently that's actually even a little bit tricky. So, again, maybe there are some workarounds here, but at the end of the day, they're not as simple as they sometimes seem.
Exactly. Well, excellent, Joel. Really appreciate your insight and the conversation. Hopefully we get more details and understanding over the next few days.
That's right, because all this advice a week from now will make probably no sense because it will be a different world.
That's right.